ACNF is going to hold some space here for the 2025 Power of Narrative Conference, held on the final weekend of March at Boston University. I've struck up a promotional partnership, promotional exchange with them, and there will be a discount for enrollment for podcast listeners coming soon. I went several years ago, and I'm very excited to attend again. And if you're a journalist, it's pretty friggin' awesome.
But the thread that I came by was war. That's really what happened. You know, what's happening in Palestine right now. It's genocide and war. And so once I had that thread, then I traced it back. Where did this thread come from? How did the United States get formed, and how does settler colonialism work?
Oh, hey, CNFers, it's the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, the show where I speak to badass people about telling true stories. I'm Brendan O'Mara. Good for me. Today, a week before Americans celebrate Thanksgiving, I thought it apropos to celebrate Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz's Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, but more specifically, Paul Peart-Smith's graphic interpretation of Roxanne's seminal 2014 book published by Beacon Press. Paul's renderings are stunning, kinetic, raw, and you read the book and you realize the brutal, genocidal nature of settler colonialism on which this country was founded. Frankly, it's impossible not to read this book and not look at Gaza and see the exact playbook being implemented. Go read Rana Nator and Iman Mohammed's Atavist piece from a few months ago, conversation on this very show about just a sliver of the carnage playing out in Gaza. So these histories are the kinds of books we need to read. These are the real histories, not airbrushed or sanitized versions so first graders can dress up in headdresses made of construction paper. In my opinion, to be the best American or the best person you can be, you need to stare down the barrel of these histories, feel your feels, and then figure out a way to help the oppressed. That can shake out in any number of ways. I'm still figuring it out. In a capitalistic society, that might mean supporting businesses from marginalized communities. In my case, I can platform writers and artists who might not get as much attention on, say, some of the more mainstream shows. Listen, it ain't much, but in the spirit of camping, I'm trying to leave my site better than I found it. It's not nothing. It's not great, but it's not nothing. For those of you who love a good double negative, show notes to this episode and more at BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey, there you can read blog posts or sign up for the monthly Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter, book recommendations, book raffles if you're on the email list. The exclusive CNFN happy hour is going to return soon. I know you've been waiting for it. First of the month, no spam, as far as I can tell. You can't beat it. So Paul, he is a comics artist and writer for 30 plus years, whose work has appeared in 2000 AD, Horrible Histories, Marvel UK, and Sony Games. His keen interest in culture and politics led to his creator-owned graphic novel, 1+1. He has adapted W.E.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk as a graphic novel for Rutgers University Press, and his latest adaptation, An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, is published by Beacon Press. Paul's biweekly newsletter, The Ink Skull, promotes mental health and the best of comics and other arts. He currently lives with his family in Tasmania, Australia. And Roxanne, she grew up in Oklahoma and has been active in international indigenous movements for more than 4 decades. She's the author and editor of 7 other books, a few memoirs, but, of course, this is the book that you associate her name with, An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. In this conversation, let's face it, both need to come back on their own individually. We're about to talk about hard-won advice, how Roxanne finally found the through line for her book, and how Paul selected the right scenes in sections to draw because he had to distill a lot of information into a tiny package. Great stuff, CNFers. So let's get after it with a riff. You saying like one of the things that you wished you had when you were starting out as an artist was an experienced mentor and someone to pick you up when it seemed like you would never land a paid gig. And I wonder, just maybe you can take us back to that headspace of what it's like, be it a writer or an illustrator or a comic artist, of trying to get that necessary traction when you're just really frustrated and you're banging your head against the wall.
Yeah, well, you go from reading this stuff, growing up, and sort of imagining these heroic characters sort of sitting and creating this stuff. Once you realize that they're actually created by people. And I started off like many kids in comics, sort of reading, Marvel and DC stuff. And the Marvel backstory, the sort of like the kind of there's a kind of meta narrative that was running behind each story, was that there was a whole bunch of creators who were having a great time in this place called the Bullpen, which was in my mind anyway located within the basement of Marvel Studios, Marvel headquarters. You just got this sense that there was there was a real sort of energy creating this stuff. But of course, when you are sort of sitting in London or wherever you may be as a kid and thinking, okay, I want to do this, it's tricky to figure out where that, how you can access that energy, access that sort of that team, that group camaraderie that you see in the book. So I just toiled away in my room, drawing and hoping that somehow I would get seen. And it was only through meeting other cartoonists who were hoping the same thing and then attending comics conventions where you get to actually see the human beings behind these books and meet them and get advice from them and see a way forwards that it begins to become real. There are many times. I mean, it's a strange industry to be in because it doesn't really have a place in the ordinary world. When you fill in a form for some mundane whatever it may be, and they ask you your profession, you never see comics artists down there. You never see anything. You barely ever see anything like illustrator. If you're in the arts, you're kind of outside of society, and so you have to create an identity for yourself, which you have to hold on to, despite reality saying that what you do doesn't exist.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a tricky place to be in when it feels like the road isn't well paved.
Yeah.
For you, right? And you're really just kind of bushwhacking and going through and trying to find and blaze your own trail, which can be energizing once you get to the other end and you can kind of see the wreckage of your body of work behind you. But it's until you get to that point, it's like you feel like you're going blind in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and that feeling actually, even if you get some measure of success, doesn't really disappear because you're always trying to move forwards. You're hoping that when you look back at your previous stuff, that you don't feel that it's better than what you're doing now, and you are trying to sort of light your own way. You've got a little torch. It's dark out there. It's not even a torch, it's a lantern. So you've just got this little area of light around you, and you just keep stepping forwards and hoping that you're moving in the right direction. And that never ends if you're doing it right. So yeah, it's sometimes really useful. I found it very useful. I was very lucky. I managed to meet some artists who were further along in their development than I was, and they were able to give me encouragement and just a way forward, just model what it would be like to be a functioning artist. Um, and it just gives you a little bit of it's you look into that darkness, you see another little lantern going along, and you think, okay, I'm okay, you know.
Absolutely. And Roxanne, similarly, when you were getting your start as a young writer and scholar, what were some of the struggles that you experienced as you were looking to similarly gain traction in your field and in mastery?
Well, I thought I always wanted to be a writer. I loved books when I was from when I was a child, and I wanted to do that. And so I was lucky. I grew up in a very rural, small place in central Oklahoma, and we didn't have very good teachers. They were sometimes just out of teachers' college or even still in college. But we did have wonderful English teachers, writing teachers in high school, not so much in grade school. And so I just was encouraged to write. We had to write a lot. We had to write papers. We had to read books and write, kind of summarize them. And so I just started learning to write when I was very young. And my mother, who's just, really a farm, just not educated. She went to the 8th grade. But she was a great writer. She wrote gossip columns for the local papers. So I would see her writing. She had this big callus on her middle finger because she wrote with a pencil and on big yellow, tablets. And so I was also an asthmatic and sick a lot and home a lot, even from school. And I would sit there watching her, write and write and write and write. And so it just, and then my oldest brother was he got more into oral, history and speaking than writing, but he was a very good writer. And he taught me how to write and read before I went to school. So, like when I was 4 years old, and I just wanted to be a writer. And I didn't really know how you did that. I said I wanted to be a journalist because I didn't really know how to be a writer. I knew that people had jobs when they were journalists, but writers really don't have jobs. And but I was lucky enough to be encouraged. Went to San Francisco State, moved to California. I was encouraged when I was graduating by the professor who was in charge of me. He insisted I go to graduate school. I hadn't intended to go to graduate school at all by that time I was married. And, I just I just wanted to learn, go to college. And I didn't. And so he just insisted. So I went to UC Berkeley and then transferred to UCLA, and you had to write a lot in history. It was just so I learned to write academically and published, a lot of academic books. And I decided it was 1989. I got very, very sick with pneumonia and then asthma, and was in bed a lot. I had to take a break from teaching. I had been, teaching in a university. And I really couldn't do anything. And so I just started writing, literary writing, where I didn't have to deal with books or anything, just what was in my mind. And I just fell in love with it. So I started going to joining writing workshops for a couple of years, just constantly. And then I got a master's in fine arts and in creative writing. I already had a PhD. I really didn't need an uh, this degree, but I got going and I said, well, they said, you should just go ahead and, get the degree. I just wanted to, be in writing workshops. So I got that degree, and then I wrote 3 literary memoirs over a period of 7 years. Yeah, 3 books and published. And so that's really how then I got into literary writing. And then Beacon Press asked me if I would care to take a look at maybe writing in this series they were doing on different peoples in the United States, different groups of people. They had already done an Afro-American history of the United States. So they wanted me to do an Indigenous peoples history of the United States. And I thought, oh, here I am back in academia. I said, no, this isn't academic. It has to be it's literary. So that was, that's then the book, the only book of mine that has been a bestseller on the New York Times or been more than one printing. It's had multiple printings, gone into all, now this graphic novel. It's really what I really like to do, sit down and write every day.
I love, reading, I believe it's in the introduction to the source text, that you lived with the book for 6 years, starting over something like a dozen times before settling on a narrative thread.
Right.
So maybe take us to that headspace, because that's that starts and stops can be very discouraging to a lot of writers. And I imagine you experienced that too, but you had the endurance to persevere and to find that thread.
Yeah, I really wrote so many. The first one I wrote was came out to about 1,500 pages, and I knew it was just not right, and I knew I had to find a thread to go through the book, to write a literary academic book. It's a serious book. It's not just literary. It's also research based, but that the research shouldn't be too heavy. There are quite a few footnotes, but not as much as in a general academic book. And I realized it was boring. It was just this happened and then this happened and this happened and I had already written some academic books, and they weren't like that. But somehow this was seemed like such a huge project. How could I do a 300-page book in the whole history of the United States from its founding and from the point of view of Indigenous peoples? So, the reason the editor at Beacon called on me is I had been actually an activist in many things, many movements, since the 60s. But I got kind of pulled into supporting the Native American movement and ended up, helping form a process for Indigenous peoples at the United Nations, and so it's part activist and also writing a lot, but writing short pieces. And then I did write a book called Indians of the Americas. That was in 1981. So then I started trying to write history of the United States, and I just on my own, without a contract, before I was asked to. And I couldn't find a thread then, so I kind of gave it up. Wrote 100 pages and gave it up, and then I wrote the memoirs. But the thread that I came by was war. That's really what happened. What's happening in Palestine right now. It's genocide and war. And so once I had that thread, then I traced it back where did this thread come from? How did the United States get formed, and how does settler colonialism work?
And Paul, when you were reading reading the source text, and what is it about graphic nonfiction and comics that makes such an effective vector for the storytelling?
Well, I think it's the combination of words and pictures. Of course, it's akin to the way that music works on people. There's a kind of a subconscious and conscious effect of experiencing that art form. You've got the images that hit you in the heart, the words that hit you in the head, and then the sort of combination of the two sort of playing off each other, creating different sensations and also imparting information. It's a very powerful brew. And it's also a one-to-one experience as well. You don't read these things, in a group. You're sat having a direct relationship with the material in the same way that you would with a book. I've always felt this, even when I was drawing guys in tights hitting each other, that the medium itself is much more powerful than that. Don't get me wrong. I mean that's an entertaining side of the medium, but it's by no means its limit. And we're just really beginning to scratch the surface of how this powerful medium can be used to shape and change the way that we think about the things that we've really taken for granted. I mean, looking this book looks at history and makes it new again, makes it real again, and I think right now, as Roxanne mentioned, it's just so important to realize that we've always been here, that we've always had this quality within us that can sort of descend into savagery for what we think are high and lofty reasons, but really it's just base fear and fear turning to aggression. And we've always been here, we haven't evolved, or if we're evolving, of course, it's a very slow process, and we're not that far away from the events of our book.
And what was the speaking of comic characters and tights, the spidey sense that kind of went off in your head when you would come across a passage from Roxanne's book, and you're like, oh, this moment really lends itself to that visual interpretation.
Yeah, it is literally that. It is literally a kind of an intuition that I can see it in my head. It's a brilliantly written book, so there are many images that are suggested, and I had to edit through to the ones that I thought that would personify a certain period in the book. Across the period of time that we're talking about. We're talking about centuries of war and human interactions. So I had to pick and choose the ones that I thought would be the most powerful and would work narratively as a comic book. But yeah, it's literally that. It's that I'm sure that if another artist saw the read the same material, that they would perhaps pick out other moments. It's what resonates with me, and I thought that I could do a good job with.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it is. The visuals are really brilliant and evocative, and just the way you bring it brings it to life in a way that I think is just brilliantly effective. And it's so in terms of your style and how you arrived at your artistic voice on the page. How did you arrive at your particular style, and how did that lend itself to this particular project?
I'm very agnostic about my style. I think other people can see my style much more clearly than I can. I really try to relate to the material the best way I can, and I don't really set any rules for myself as to how I approach things. So for this particular project, I actually spent quite a lot of time thinking about how I was approaching. And in fact, even as I was in the depth of the actual producing the artwork, I was still having decisions to make about, does this serve this well? Am I getting this bit right? And so it's really is a sort of a voyage of discovery. Each project, I haven't really got to that stage where I'm just sort of like I've got a bunch of tricks and I keep playing them. I'm not actually criticizing that way of producing, because there is a side of comics which is very much, this is a cottage industry where you've got to hit your deadlines and you've got to produce, and also there's a kind of there is a benefit to having a smooth way of producing stuff, so that when you read it you don't really even feel the hand of the artist involved. You're just reading the characters. That is completely valid. But for me, I guess I never got rid of the sort of art school side of me that really wants to find a new way of sort of like of relating to whatever it is that I'm doing, and trying to find a new way to actually make that powerful for the person reading it. This is a long-winded way of saying I kind of discovered my way through the project.
And Roxanne, I love in the author's note of the original book. You write in the very first paragraph, the final sentence is like the genesis of this book was gonna come from outside the academy, and that speaks to the narrative thrust of the thing, and that it isn't academic. And so, like, what do you make of, say, the American educate or the United States educational system, where maybe some of the most formative, the most honest, and of histories has to come from books of this nature that are in fact outside the academy, as you write?
Yeah, I think for me, having gone through graduate school, but already really deeply involved with stories, telling stories. And I love novels. I love fiction. I always have a book of fiction going at all the time, whatever I'm doing. Because to me, that fiction writers, sort of like artists, have, they have to compress things and not, go into kind of boring details, but capture with the language. And because I went to graduate school, I really had to unlearn that a lot in writing this book. I practiced with the memoirs. It's easier when it's in the I voice, and I'm doing the memoir, than when I'm not the the main the character at all. I think that it's writing and reading is really important, but the visual, it's the extent to which I can make it visual in words, and I think poets do that, so it doesn't mean it can't be done. I'm not a poet. I admire poets so much. They sort of worship poetry, and but I have learned from it how to be. And I think this is also when an adaptation to visuals is. I had some practice with this, with working with Raoul Peck on Exterminate All the Brutes, his 4-part HBO series a couple of years ago. And that's the first time I ever worked with a script, and how very few words, how he could take a whole concept that maybe is a whole chapter in my book. He was using my book as an adaptation. And with one sentence, capture it, because he's a screenwriter. I didn't have that experience yet, when I was writing an Indigenous people's history of the United States. But I did find it easier. It wasn't easy to take, the script was, he took it from my book and a couple of other books, whole swaths of things. And he'd say, take this maybe 500-page words, 500 words, and to one sentence, how to shrink that. And so that's what I think the artist has to do visually, is capture that. And the thing that I think, well, so many things about Paul's interpretation, I think the thing that impresses me the most is how he uses darkness, because it is a dark story. And then at the end, how he uses a light comes on. And so it's how to write tragedy without it being really seeing, I like a lot of people in the United States really think of Indians as losers, Native Americans. They lost, they lost. They never actually lost a war. I tried to find a time when they lost a war. They never lost a battle. They never lost a war. But genocide is, where they go in and kill the women and children. And destroy their villages and homes, not when, in a confrontation, any real war fighting, they always lost. So they're actually, they actually won by surviving. So I think he captures that, that darkness, it gets darker and darker, and then kind of lights up again. And I think that's really brilliant.
And there's a quote at the start of the introduction of the source text from Willie Johns of the Brighton Seminole Reservation in Florida, where he says, we are here to educate, not forgive. We are here to enlighten, not accuse. And I think both of these, the graphic interpretation and the source text, do exactly that. It enlightens us if we're open to reading and having our sense of the history of this country sort of rewire our brains a bit from what we were taught as children. And I wonder for you, Roxanne, it's just like, why is it so hard for people to reckon with the actual like brutal history of this country's growth?
Yeah, I think there's undercurrent of guilt, but it's also a nation of immigrants. That's the next book I wrote. It's not a nation of immigrants; it's settler colonialism. But immigrants come. I mean, the main population is children of immigrants in the United States, and the old. I'm from the original ugly settlers of Appalachia, the Scots-Irish killers, and so it's, but for people to, they feel guilty. There's a lot of white guilt, and wonderful people. I mean, there's, say, Trump's people. I don't think they have any guilt at all, but people who know any of these things, and are not racist or anti-racist, they really feel guilty about it, as they feel guilty about slavery. But guilt isn't a very productive thing. It's acknowledgement, and then how to change that. How to see that, that really try to make a point. And of course, literature is an art, I think, are really the drivers of mental change, of changing people's opinions, and film, that more than academic books are, just because they get kind of boring. This happened and this happened and this happened. So I think getting the passion into the story is, I guess it's really what makes the graphic version, the graphic novel as such, so powerful. I think Paul's his next book, he says his next work is going to be Malcolm X. Isn't that right, Paul?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and wow, what that will be is so important and so timely. But I do think the text to work from, the book, he's going to use Alex Haley's wonderful book, which is, so well written. There have been a lot of Malcolm biographies that are maybe better, but not so well, creatively written. So I think, especially because young people will get to, a lot of young people have read my book. I was on constant up until the pandemic, from 2014 to 2020. I was on the road with this book all the time. I realized I was exhausted. The pandemic was a rest for me. It's like, oh God, I started doing everything remotely, and but I was traveling and traveling and traveling. People, I didn't know it became a bestseller, and no one can really say why that happened, but it didn't get a single review, either academic or in any newspaper. I think there was one little piece by a friend of mine in the San Francisco Chronicle. It's strange how something catches on and people just tell, have you read this book? And it just rings a chord, and it surprised us all. Beacon has they publish very serious books. They have they're owned by the Unitarian Church, and so they have a passion, for good books, but and they get used in especially in courses, university courses a lot, and then now they have children. There is a young people's version of Indigenous peoples. It's done very well too, separately, and I'm hoping that the graphic novel will too, really catch on. I think it will. It's already, I think, going out of this first printing, and so I can't even remember what you asked me.
Oh yeah, it just you definitely touched on it. It's just kind of the idea of the way how just learning about the real history that isn't in the textbooks that I certainly grew up with and was educated on, and then just reckoning with the real brutality and that guilt that you referenced. And I think a way to you can, like in a kind of a meditation practice, okay, note that guilt. Okay, now what are you going to do about it? And in the back of your book, you have dozens of books of suggested reading, which is a great place to start to educate yourself outside of the academy, as we were saying a moment ago. But also with Paul's rendering of the book too, this is like it's immersive in a way that I think will really, I don't know, break down people's barriers to start learning about this history, and then they'll be like, oh, okay, I'll pick up the Roxanne's book if they don't already have it, and because Paul's greased the skids with what his beautiful rendering of your story is done too.
Yeah, they'll want to know more, right, and more details. I think what I did, that books on U.S. history, they always have now. I mean, they didn't until the sort of uprisings in the 1960s, where textbooks and history books were just sort of left out. They were really a white republic, and who was president, and the Civil War. During I point out that during the Civil War, there was a bloody massacres going on in Illinois, and in Minnesota, wars against Native people, the Dakota Wars, and none of that is in, the chapters on the Civil War. period, it's not even in there. It didn't happen. So it gets missed, and anyone who's teaching the book, they don't even know it happened. So.
And it blows my mind that Andrew Jackson is still on the $20 bill. Like it totally, I'm flabbergasted.
Aren't they trying to replace him with Sojourner Truth or someone, I think not Sojourner Truth, but Harriet Tubman, one or the other. No, they didn't choose to. It's the $10 bill or something they're putting on. It's really hard to get rid of Andrew Jackson.
My gosh. And Paul, the structure of the book, you follow follow the corn, the promised land, the White Republic, Indian country from discovery to sovereignty, and in your rendering and in taking, condensing as best you can Roxanne's book, what was it about this structure that resonated strongest?
It just seemed to tell the whole story so far in the clearest way possible. I mean, what I did was I took a bunch of notes. I took extracts from the book, along with my research assistant Dylan Davis and Paul Bull, and sort of worked out a narrative structure based on excerpts from the book, and then I broke that down into pages, and then I drew those out as a thumbnail, what we call a thumbnail, which is a small, rough version of the final artwork, so I could see and start to think about the visual translation of the work, and so that through that process, there was a kind of a natural editing of anything that seemed to be straying off the point, and it had to work as in that thumbnail version. That gave me a very strong path for then being able to get on with the final artwork. So yeah, it was just like and I also was mindful of trying to make sure that it was a book that had hope throughout all that darkness. It was really very gratifying to hear Roxanne describe the book in that way, the adaptation in that way, because that's what I set out to do, to not shy away from the brutality and the horror, but also not to make this a horror book, There had to be some sense of, there was a redemption is too strong a word, but a hope for the future and a kind of a reinvigoration of the culture, and a recapturing of some of those territories. I mean, one of my favorite parts of the book was the Black Hills. Basically, the Black Hills were held by, it's worth thousands and thousands of dollars to the state, to the United States, but the Sioux have refused to take the money that was given to them or offered to them to give away the Black Hills. They've refused to take it, and they're holding on to it because it means more to them than the money that they're being offered. I love the idea that there's a kind of a reinvigoration of the soul of the people, and a real sort of strength to hold on to their culture, and that had to come through in the book. So yeah, the path that I chose was basically one of it's a story of redemption. It's a story of coming through really horrible stuff. So yeah, I hope I chose the path that best illustrates that.
Well, yeah, and then like the final panel of the book, features the closing, passage from the Acoma poet Simon Ortiz, and it's the future will not be mad with loss and waste, though the memory will be there. Eyes will become kind and deep, and the bones of this nation will mend after the revolution. Yeah. And I just love the the sentiment of that it does take some breaking to rebuild, and things can come back together with the acknowledgement that the pair of you have brought to the fore. That so yeah, it will mend, but there has to be this recognition of the breakage.
Yeah, yeah. And I find it kind of incredible that this is still a controversial point of view. There are some people who still feel that this is inflammatory to talk about. It seems strange to me because it is history, and most of the time, people who argue against what's it, critical race theory and this sort of thing, basically looking at the reality of the way that cultures have been imposed on people. I find it incredible that they want to ignore that history, because, as I say, yeah, most of the time these people are sort of the same people who would say, look, we can't erase history. You can't knock down statues because that's an erasure of history. You can't, start putting black people in movies where they don't belong, because somehow this is rewriting history. Well, this is actual history. And I don't understand, and I don't see the advantage to ignoring it or wishing it away or rebranding it, as some people have tried to, as the Europeans as just peaceful settlers who accidentally wiped out a load of people with disease. I mean, it's just counterproductive. As you say, we need to actually really see the way things have been, to realize that we're not that far away from it, and that whatever solutions we've come up with in the past in order to make things better, we need to be looking at them again. Yeah, it's incredible to me that this is still controversial, but this book is really important, and I'm glad that it exists. I'm glad that Roxanne's book exists, and I'm glad that I was able to do this adaptation of it.
Oh, absolutely. And given that in the U.S., the Washington football team finally changed its name a couple times. I wish they stuck with the football team versus going to the Commanders, but that's neither here nor there. Cleveland baseball team changed its name, and what struck me, and I had no idea about this, was the Texas Rangers and their responsibility in destroying indigenous towns, eliminating native nations in Texas, pursuing ethnic cleansing. And here's a team that won the World Series. And I just thought it was just kind of, oh, yeah, Texas Outlaws. Yeah, that makes sense, Rangers. But I had no idea their culpability in the elimination of indigenous towns. I was like, more people need to know about that, because that seems just as awful as the other names for the other teams. And frankly, I'd like to see that one, a recognition of what that means, and then have it change, because that seems just as offensive, if not more so.
Yeah, Ranger is like cowboys and Indians,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to be mindful of your time, Roxanne and Paul. And one of the things I've been liking to bring these types of conversations down for a landing is just to ask the guests, the pair of you in this case, of some of the best advice in your writing or in the comics writing that you've received, either from a cherished mentor or maybe just hard-earned advice from being in the mill for decades. So I just extend that to you. What is some of the best advice you've heard or learned from your own experience?
You go first, Paul.
Oh, thanks. What's the best advice that I've heard? I've come to understand. Actually, this is good. Robert Crumb always said that every line is an act of will, and what he meant was that the amount of concentration needed was that basically everything that you put down is really an expression of who you are and your point of view. And the quicker you sort of realize that, the quicker you realize that it's not necessarily about having a set of skills, though a set of skills is useful, but it's actually about having a point of view. The better it is for you, because you're not then relying on the sort of material results of what you do. Comics isn't like, as everybody knows, for most people, comics isn't like a major money spinner. And if you're looking to sort of buy your yacht based on comics, I mean, you've got a lot of work to do, internal work to do, let's put it that way. So you really have got to put the value in expressing yourself, to honing yourself, to being the artist you want to be, to saying what it is that you want to say, to that is where you need to put your values. And I've found, since I've adopted that way of thinking, that it's just been it's actually paradoxically been much better for my career, because I have a sort of I have faith in my ability to keep growing and keep learning, and that's I think that's important advice to pass on to especially to young artists who are sort of like worried about career and style and those sort of things. They're not as important as being honest with yourself and really having a point of view.
Oh, that's brilliant. How about you, Roxanne?
Well, I think, there's some inevitability that we don't really like to. We think we're making our own path, and maybe failing or succeeding or whatever. But I think we have less control over our lives than we imagine that we do. That some things are. I had a really good friend in my undergraduate years who's a Greek daughter of Greek immigrants, very working class woman, and as I was, and San Francisco State was pretty much a working class university at the time, and she said everything that happens as it has to, from all of the steps that go before it. So it's important to be conscious what you're doing, because it's going to push you in some way or another, that we maybe don't take ourselves seriously enough of how much damage we can do, either to ourselves or to others, to, be really aware. And I think that writing or art in general can really enhance that understanding, that we're, and film, it can make us, it's so powerful. I just saw the movie The Apprentice, and I think everyone should see it. It's quite brilliant. Some people thought it was too easy on Trump. It's Trump and Cohen. Cohen taught him how to be a monster, but it's actually very. It humanizes them in the sense that they're how corruption works, and especially in a capitalist society. I think literature and art expressions really are not very accessible to the majority of the population in the United States, and that it's very purposeless. Purposeful, I think, in the training to be good citizens. You're not supposed to know too much.
Awesome. Yes. All right. Thanks to Roxanne and Paul. That was a good one. Paul has a Malcolm X graphic book coming out. Roxanne has many memoirs. Gotta have them back. This is cool. And good stuff. Okay. So this parting shot, it kind of came out of nowhere. I was going to write about something else, and then this kind of came up, and I was just going to go with it. I'm not looking for pity here. I want to be right up front. I'm going to reiterate that at the end of this riff, but I just want to say that right up top. So can I share a little secret? It's quite dispiriting for me. I went back 1 year in terms of podcast downloads. A year ago, there was close to 12,000 downloads in the month of November 2023. This month we'll have about 4,000. The graph is practically a direct line down, like a fucking slope. I don't understand. This in a year where long form sunsetted, and I'm getting more book pitches than ever before. You know, I understand people outgrow podcasts. I've been vocal about ones I've outgrown, and I understand people likely outgrow me. I'm an acquired taste, as you know. Or they just move on, or you just don't like me. As you know, I'm not your classic literary podcaster. I'm way fucking cooler. I've had some home run guests this year in the usual slate of great mid-listers without feedback, and I get so little feedback. My only feeling is that perhaps the election year had something to do with people's attention, or perhaps people have grown fatigued with podcasts in general. There's too little time in the day and too many podcasts. You know, maybe it's overwhelming to see a new one come out every single week, and you feel like you have to keep pace, and if you can't, you just give up. It's like the pile of New Yorkers that show up in your mailbox every week. It's like, God damn it. If I can just read the cartoons, I'll be happy. And it reminds me of the scene in The Good Place where one of their torture rooms is just a New Yorker coming in like every 10 seconds. And Ted Danson's character is just like, they just keep on coming. It's so true. It's dispiriting in that, as many of you know, if you listen this far in the show, you're a true fan. I have a book coming out, and my only platform to speak of is this podcast. It's actually what made me attractive to my agent and my publisher. So who knows if I'm going to be fired from them when this is all said and done. So now the very thing that made me attractive is just cratering. I mean, I've lost more than 60% of my audience from a year ago. Like, what changed? I know my approach hasn't changed. Maybe that's the problem. I mean, am I the problem? I get maybe one email a month from listeners saying that they like a particular conversation, that they got something out of it. They really liked the repartee. The Mirren Fader one has actually gotten a couple. That one made me very uncomfortable, and I know, Mirren, I think, hates me as a result of it. But people have reached out about that one. Like, that one struck a chord with them, mainly like biography and exploitation. So I know it hits for some, but that drop in audience would get a show canceled in any other market. But thankfully, we're like a DIY punk rock show. That's the ethos of the show, or independent. I know many of my guests rarely share their time on this show with their audiences. I'm only on Instagram, and I don't see it. I notice it with my own eyes. I notice what I'm not noticing, let's say. They share their time on other podcasts, but for some reason, they don't share their time on this one. And they don't even like their own audiograms I post. I mean, why am I doing all this work? I mean, people get a notification when they're tagged, right? It all comes down to status, really. I've riffed on that before. And as the show's audience continues to crater, I can't exactly say they're going to sell 100 books for their time on the show, as much as you guys buy books. And I can't ask them and be like, hey, I keep noticing that you share all the other podcasts you're on. Like, may I ask why you don't share this one? It's like, why am I bothering reading all your books cover to cover? Why do you even want to be on this show if, by all appearances, you're embarrassed or ashamed of your time here at CNF Pod HQ? Why are you wasting your time? I guess, why are you wasting mine? It's wild. And like I said at the top of this parting shot, like, I'm not asking for pity. I'm not looking for pity. It's just the data. And it depresses the hell out of me. It's not going to stop me. I don't know what I'd do without it. I just compulsively, I'm addicted to it. But it does make you question if people are getting anything out of it. Maybe people don't care anymore. Or maybe they only care about celebrity authors. Or maybe they hate my voice or my complaining, which I wouldn't knock you for that. I do complain a lot, but I put it at the end of the show. You know, that's why. So, and very few of you listen this far. Like, very few. I would say there's probably like a dozen who listen this far. So in any case, that's the sad news. So stay wild, see you nevers. And if you can't do interview, see ya.